You this evening from the Vancouver area, where we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We acknowledge that the deep connections to the history of these communities on this land are grateful for their continued stewardship here. Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems, and we support the needs, aspirations, and rights of Indigenous peoples to care for the land. So, as I mentioned, both Amie and I work for Birds Canada, which is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to bird conservation, with Motus being a core program in partnership with many other collaborating institutions. And Amy's just getting us set up here with our presentation. So here we are. So we'll be talking all today about Motus, the Motus Wildlife Tracking System, which is an international collaborative endeavor to track the movements of small flying animals such as birds, bats, and even some small insects. So Amie and I will be going through some background about Motus and how it all works, and then dive into some really interesting examples of some cool research projects that have been using Motus. Next slide, please. Perfect. So to start us off, the conservation of migratory species can be extremely challenging because it requires considering threats that occur at different stages of their life cycle that typically span multiple jurisdictions, habitats, and landscapes that are often thousands of kilometers apart. So in order to enact effective conservation measures for migratory birds, we first kind of have to understand where populations are facing their largest threats or where bottlenecks might be occurring, and then prioritize where and what conservation actions may have the greatest benefits. So here on the screen, we have as an example, some of the challenges that are faced when studying migratory species and why understanding the full annual life cycle is so important. So our example here is a red knot, which holds near and dear, especially to Amy's heart as she worked on red knots in James Bay for her graduate studies project, actually. So a little bit of background on red knots. They are a long-distance migratory shorebird that experienced large-scale declines in the late 90s and early 2000s due to the overharvesting of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay. So just on the left there, you'll see a map of important nesting areas and key wintering areas and stopover sites. So during northbound migration, red knots will actually feed on horseshoe crab eggs during their spring stopover in Delaware Bay. So as horseshoe crabs are coming onto the shore to spawn, red knots will go and they'll just gorge themselves on these very nutritional eggs and put on so much fat that they can actually double their body weight in almost a 2-week time period so that they can fuel the rest of their migration to the Arctic, where they then breed. So like I mentioned, horseshoe crabs were overfished, and they were actually fished as bait, which led to the overfishing. And although these fisheries are much more regulated now, red knot populations have stabilized somewhat, but have not really seen quite the recovery that we would want after these steep declines in the 90s and early 2000s. So that means that there's probably other threats that are preventing their recovery somewhere along their annual cycle. So the question remains, where and when in the annual cycle between breeding in the Arctic and their wintering grounds, which can be as far south as Patagonia, which you can see on this map here, where are they facing these threats that are preventing recovery? So being able to understand the full annual cycle of a species and how all the different seasons and places where they stop are linked together is especially important to effective conservation, but very challenging for migratory species just due to how mobile they are. So tracking technologies are actually one really great tool that we can use that can give us a lot of insight into an animal's life cycle. Next slide, please. Great. So here, just to provide you with a few different examples of tracking technology that is out there right now. There are many different types, but the important thing to note is that they're all complementary, and there's no real one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to selecting a tracking technology. It really depends on your research question, and that'll kind of dictate what you decide to use. So just going through the examples here, we have geolocators, which are great. They give you a full year of data and determine rough location based on day length. But in order to retrieve that data, you do have to recapture the individual. So an example of that is just in the top left-hand corner there on that blackpoll warbler. Another example is just traditional banding. So it's inexpensive when compared to other tracking technologies, and it's not as invasive. However, recapture rates can be on the lower side because, again, you do need to recapture the bird in that case. And similar to banding, we also have leg flags. They're similar in that it's, again, inexpensive and less invasive, but there are higher recite rates than you would see in comparison to banding because you don't actually need to recapture the bird. You're just reciting them. And then moving on to a little bit more higher tech tracking technology, on the bottom left there, we have an example of a GPS tag, which can be quite precise, but it's very limited in the number of points that are actually recorded. And again, you have to recapture the individual as well. Next to GPS tags, we also have satellite tags, which are great and provide a lot of location data as well. But the technology is not quite there yet in order to deploy them on smaller species of birds like passerines. And then lastly on the screen, we have an example of radio-telemetry tags. They are much smaller, and so you can put them on smaller birds. But the only drawback is that a bird must pass close to a receiver in order to get a detection. So collecting data is really dependent on your receiver coverage. So where does Motus fit in to all the different tracking devices here? So in its essence, the Motus Wildlife Tracking System is an international collaborative research network that uses coordinated and automated radio telemetry to facilitate research and education on the ecology and conservation of migratory animals. So Motus uses radio telemetry, and that's actually been around for quite some time. Radio telemetry has been used to track animals since the 1960s. It's overall, the fundamental concepts really haven't changed too much as well, but the technology has significantly developed. So essentially how radio telemetry works is you have a transmitter that emits a signal at a specific frequency, and then that signal is picked up by an antenna that's connected to a receiver that's monitoring or listening to that frequency. And receivers can be either in fixed locations or they can be mobile as well. So as an example, in this photo, this black and white photo here on screen, we have a receiver that's inside a car, and the antennas are most likely mounted just on the outside of the car on the roof there. So this would be an example of a mobile receiver from back in the day. And then traditionally, how the whole system works together then is that transmitters would each operate at different frequencies so that they could be individually identified based on those frequencies. And then the receiver would then cycle through the set of frequencies, monitoring for each of the different transmitters. So Motus uses radio telemetry, but with a little bit of a twist. So the philosophy behind the Motus Wildlife Tracking System is that we essentially want to be able to harness the collective power of many different individual research projects into one big coordinated effort that can basically expand the scale and scope of everyone's work while also maximizing limited funding available for research. So essentially, the philosophy is we should all be working together. So that's the twist on Motus. So instead of having transmitters operating on different frequencies, Motus transmitters are operating on the same frequency and can be individually identified through digitally encoded IDs instead. So this way, using shared frequencies, all of the receiver stations within the network are continuously monitoring for all wildlife carrying transmitters. So the key to Motus is shared infrastructure as well. So any tag that has been deployed in a local area or region can also be detected by any receiver within the global network. So the system originally was designed to grow and develop cooperatively. so everyone can benefit from it, of course, but most importantly, we can work collaboratively on our research so that it also benefits conservation efforts as much as possible. So what that means is that researchers can still work on their own projects using Motus, but then the information from those projects can also be leveraged to collectively gain more information about threats that might be affecting migratory species. All right, so what are the advantages then of using radio telemetry in comparison to other tracking technologies and the Motus Wildlife Tracking System? Well, like I mentioned on the tracking slide with all of the different, or the devices slide with all the different tracking technology, radio telemetry tags are actually the smallest available devices. So some can weigh as little as 0.2 grams, and they can be put on smaller animals that are too small to carry other technology like satellite tags. Another added benefit is that it's a coordinated and automated system. So automated meaning that the receivers are continuously monitoring for transmitters and listening for tags all of the time, independent of you being there or not. Another great benefit or advantage of using radio telemetry is that it has very high temporal precision. So when a bird is detected by a receiver station, you know it was there down to the second. And this can be really helpful when you're studying something like departure timing. So you might have a research question like, when do birds leave a stopover site on migration and under what weather conditions? So you can actually link precise timing of your detection data to other variables such as atmospheric pressure, precipitation, temperature at the time, things like that. Another great advantage is you don't need to recapture the bird to get the data back. Detections are stored actually on the receiver and not on the transmitter, unlike other devices like geolocators. And lastly, a huge advantage of using radio telemetry and the Motus Wildlife Tracking System is that since it's collaborative, there's centralized data management. So Birds Canada houses all of the data for any projects that are a part of Motus, and then is integrated in the Motus database where researchers can then access this information, or it's made publicly available through the Motus website itself. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a closer look now at the actual key components of the system. So we'll start with radio transmitters. There's basically two main types. There's solar power versus battery power tags. But which one you select is really quite dependent on your study species and your research questions. So I'll start with battery powered tags. So there's an example of the four tags there. The top right is an example of a battery powered tag. And they are very commonly used, and they can weigh as little as 0.2 grams. But because they are so light, they do have a shorter battery life because the batteries are so small. So there is a trade-off with that. Larger tags, of course, last longer, but are heavier. So that's something to consider. When talking about animal care guidelines, the tracking devices must weigh less than 3% of the individual's mass. So again, the size of your study species and the duration of your tracking really dictates how large of a tag that you would be deploying on an animal. Now, alternative to battery-powered tags, there are solar tags as well, and of course they don't have any battery and can also be quite light. They can be as light as less than half a gram, but of course they only transmit during daylight hours. So again, you kind of need to consider your study species and your research question when considering what tag that you should select. So if your research question or you were tracking nocturnal movements, perhaps maybe solar tags are not the best option for you. And an example of that is just on the left-hand side of the screen there as well. And then lastly, on the bottom right-hand corner, there's also a hybrid type that's available as well. It has a battery in it and also has little tiny solar cells that can recharge the battery. So it can just go and go and go and essentially last indefinitely. But because there is a little battery in there, of course, it is heavier. So just things to consider. And here, of course, we have another little photo of a red knot, just showing an example of what it looks like when an animal has been tagged. So it might be hard to see in this little photo because the transmitter antenna is so thin, but if you can see it, it's a thin little line that's kind of extending out over the tail of the red knot there. Thank you, Amie. It's great. Okay, so let's talk about receiver stations now. So this is the actual infrastructure that detects the tagged animals. So as you can see, they come in all different types of forms and designs, and they can be located in a bunch of different places and habitat types. So kind of just threw a collage of photos together here to provide some examples of some stations that Amie and I have installed in northern BC. But basically, you just need your antennas to be elevated and fastened securely to a mast or a structure, and then the antennas are connected via cables to the computer part of the receiver station. So examples of station design in the photos here, I'll just go through. So stations could be freestanding on their own. So in the top right-hand photo here is an example of a station that was installed on Bullhead Mountain, which is just outside of Hudson's Hope. And then stations could also be attached to existing infrastructure, whether that be a building or a telephone pole. So in the bottom left-hand corner there, we have a photo of our Powder King station, and that was just attached to a telephone pole that had been there at the site. And then an example of a station that is attached to a building. Just above the photo of Powder King is a station that Amie and I installed at the University of Northern British Columbia on the administration building. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So yeah, a little bit more on receiver stations. So they can be powered one of two ways. You can either use solar panel, as you can see in the top photo here on this wetland viewing platform, or you can actually just plug in the receiver station to a standard outlet. So like I mentioned, we had installed that station on the admin building of the UNBC. So there was a utility room there that we could just immediately just plug the station into a standard outlet, which is nice. So generally, after you've set up your station, under ideal conditions, they can detect a tagged bird upwards of 15 kilometers or more away. But the thing to note is that a clear line of sight will help with your detection distance. So if you have things like high vegetation, buildings or other infrastructure, and even close mountain ranges could severely decrease your detection range. So an example of that would be just the bottom photo there is a station in Montana that's been installed quite up high on a hill there. Okay, now for the brains of the operation here. So we have the tags, the receiver stations, but I mentioned that there's a computer aspect to it. So there's two different types of receiver computers. You can have either a sensor station or a sensor gnome. Both work similarly, they just are made by different companies. And they can be connected to either the internet or the cell network to automatically transfer data back to the Birds Canada Motus database. However, if neither are available where the station is located, you can actually physically visit the station and just manually download the data from there, either using a USB connection or a direct Ethernet connection to a laptop. And the interesting thing about the receiver computers as well is that they're built on open source software. So if anyone was ever interested in building their own or tinkering with one, they could definitely do so. Personally, I do not know how, so I will leave that to the professionals. Okay, moving on. So this is kind of where the Motus network stands as it is right now. This is a map of all of the receiver stations across the world, and each yellow dot represents a Motus station. So it really is an international network at this point, and it's growing all of the time. So as of right now, there are over 2,000 stations. Most of them are in Eastern North America, where Motus originated from. So you can see the concentration of yellow dots around the Great Lakes region. But it's also been really growing and taking off in Central America and South America, even parts of Northern Europe. And there's a few dots there in Australia. And even here in Western North America, there's been a lot of growth and expansion along the coast and into the north as well. All right, so once you have your tags deployed within a receiver network, what you get is data that reveals animal movements across the landscape. So this is kind of a visualization of what detection data may look like. So we've pulled some information from some semi-palmated sandpipers and white-rumped sandpipers that were tagged in James Bay during their southbound migration. And the movements you can see, green of the semi-palmated sandpiper and blue of the white-rumped sandpiper, that there's a difference with where they went. So semi-palmated sandpipers moved out to the east coast and closer to the upper Bay of Fundy, which makes sense because it's a known major stopover site over there for them. Whereas the white-rumped sandpipers actually moved further south along the coast. So interesting things that you can find from detection data. Okay, so I've gone through now the components of the system, and then I've shown you a snippet of what the data can look like, but Motus isn't quite as simple as just deploying some transmitters and then building some receiver stations and then seeing what you get and making a map out of it. It's really an international network that requires a lot of infrastructure support and behind the scenes maintenance to kind of keep it all running. So this slide here just kind of provides an overview of how the Motus system fits together. So you have all these different moving pieces. We'll start with collaborators. So on the left, you have collaborators and researchers who are equipping animals with tracking devices that are detected by the receiver stations. These collaborators are also inputting their project metadata and entering them into the Motus database that can connect then their detection data to that as well. And then once all of that information is sent to the Motus centralized database, it can then be accessed by researchers and collaborators through the Motus R package, or it can actually, summary data can be directly available and accessed through our Motus website for the public. So basically all of these different parts kind of show truly how collaborative the whole system is. There's so many different pieces of it that hopefully will end up contributing to science and conservation actions and even public education and engagement around migratory animal conservation. And then just to finish off this intro section here, I've pulled all this information from our website. So as of today, Motus by the numbers, like I mentioned, we have over 2,000 stations in the Motus network within 34 countries. There's been nearly 50,000 animals tagged, which is incredible, from nearly 400 species. There are over 2,600 Motus partners and collaborators that have contributed and set up projects to date. My goodness, there are 860 projects already, and that data has also contributed to over 200 publications. So it's really quite incredible how the system has grown over such a short period of time. So with that, I will pass it over to Amie to kind of dive in a little bit more to the cool, interesting research projects that have been going on with Motus.
Awesome. Thanks, Kianna, for the overview of what Motus is and how it works. Now I thought we'd get into some examples of various Motus projects to kind of give you a sense of what it can be used for and show some current projects that are in the works. And I figured I'd pick BC-based projects to show as examples for this presentation. And I'm only going to highlight a few projects that Kianna and I have been involved with in some capacity, since I know those ones best, but it's really only a fraction of the Motus projects that are currently happening in BC, let alone the rest of the world. And of course, as you'll see, these BC-based projects also have ties to other regions, since the strength of Motus is in its international and collaborative scope. So first, I'll show you a bit about a collaborative project we've been working on in northeastern BC. 5 years ago, the only Motus stations in BC were in southern BC, so there was clearly a gap in coverage in northern BC, which is both breeding territory for many species and an important meeting point between the central and Pacific flyways for migrants. So we started working with a number of biologists based in the region to plan a regional array of Motus stations that would support local tagging projects for both birds and bats. And since 2021, we've installed 23 Motus stations in the Peace region that are currently active. They're all kind of within the triangle between Dawson Creek, Prince George, and Seke Dene at the north end of Williston Reservoir. 19 of these stations are long-term full-size stations, and 4 are shorter-term mini stations that are for a specific project we've just started to look at bank swallow use of wetlands near Seke Dene. So those are these 4 little yellow squares here in the top left corner, and then all these blue circles are the long-term Motus stations that we've installed throughout the region. So I'll tell you a bit more about some of the projects that are based in the region using these stations, but these stations have also detected birds tagged elsewhere, like bank swallows that were tagged in Alaska and the Yukon, saw-whet owls that were tagged in southern BC and Montana, and Swainson's thrushes that were tagged as far away as Costa Rica. So these stations are supporting other Motus projects as well as ones that are based more closely in the region. So the first project I'll mention is one that we've been working with Ken Otter and his lab at UNBC on. So white-throated sparrows have 2 separate non-breeding regions, of the larger area in the eastern and central US, and then a separate region kind of near and along the Pacific and Oregon coasts. Some previous work from Ken Otter's lab showed that some of the white-throated sparrows that were breeding near Prince George migrated east across the Rockies to spend the non-breeding season in the Midwest US, while others stayed west of the Rockies and went to that disjunct California non-breeding region. So some of the birds were crossing the Rockies and others weren't. So we worked with Ken Otter's lab to tag white-throated sparrows near Prince George, Dawson Creek, and Seke Dene. So we had tagging sites on either side of the Rockies and in the northern part of the trench, and we wanted to see which migration routes these birds were taking and which non-breeding grounds they were using. So would the birds, for example, breeding near Dawson Creek stay east of the mountains, or would they also split with some going to each non-breeding region like the earlier evidence from Prince George? So we tagged 25 white-throated sparrows in Prince George, 25 in Dawson Creek in 2022. And I think I noticed Mark Finney's on the call, and Mark helped us out with the tagging. We actually tagged some of the sparrows in Mark's yard. So thanks again for that, Mark. And then the next year in 2023, we tagged 18 sparrows in Seke Dene. Of those, only 1 bird from Prince George definitively went to the western non-breeding area. So you can see that track here that goes from Prince George down to California. And then the next year there was 1 bird from Seke that was kind of inconclusive. We only got tracked it as far as Mackenzie, and then we lost the track of it. So from there, it could have gone either way. So inconclusive. But the majority of birds went to the US Midwest, including all of the birds that we tagged in Dawson Creek and picked up outside of their breeding territories. So we found no evidence that those Dawson Creek birds were crossing westward over the Rockies. They were staying east and heading east and south towards the States. So yeah, you can see that on these maps here, how the vast majority of our detections kind of happened going through the prairies and then down into the US Midwest for most of the Prince George birds, all of the Dawson Creek birds, and most of the Seke Dene birds as well. So this project is part of one of Ken Otter's honor students' theses. So Joel Koo's been leading a lot of the analysis for this project. And these results actually tie into some earlier work from Ken's lab where they looked at spatial shifts in white-throated sparrow song variation over time. And they were looking at two variations of white-throated sparrow song, one that ends in triplets. I'm going to see if this plays here. Hopefully it works. So it has kind of the same, the intro 3 notes, but then triplets at the end. Whereas, and then there's the other variation that ends with doublets. Just give this a second to play here. Yeah. So that ends more of a, the ending has more of a do, 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 do. So before 2000, there were very few recordings of this doublet song. And the doublets are shown on these maps in blue here. So there's really, before 2000, really just this one little area in northeastern BC where there were some recordings of the doublets, and otherwise mostly the triplets shown in red here. But then kind of in the mid 2000s and onwards, that doublet song really spread eastward. So we see a lot more recordings towards the Great Lakes and the eastern and US Midwest of those doublet songs. And when you look at our Motus data on migration, a lot of the birds are heading eastward over towards the US Midwest. So they may be overlapping on migration and on the non-breeding grounds with birds that are breeding more in Central and Eastern North America, which suggests to us that song learning, tutoring, and cultural transmission of that song variant may be happening on migration and on the non-breeding grounds, not just songs on the breeding grounds. So having that song learning happening on migration or on the non-breeding grounds could explain the spread of that doublet song variant moving from west to east. And the white-throated sparrow example that I just went through is probably the closest project to completion that I have to share today. The rest are all kind of very much in progress, but I'll tell you a little bit about a couple of other projects that are using the Motus stations in the Peace region. Environment and Climate Change Canada, Greg Mitchell's a research scientist with them, and Sarah Endenberg, a grad student, are leading a project studying migratory connectivity of bank swallows, breeding all the way from Alaska to Nova Scotia. And Motus is a really good system for using in a large-scale project like this because of its international coverage and its centralized database, which facilitates analysis of data collected across a wide geographic area, since they're all using the same system. So there are a number of tagging sites kind of across North America at bank swallow colonies. And we helped tag bank swallows at one site, which was along the Peace River, fairly close to the Alberta-BC border. And you can see the bank swallows foraging above the river in this photo. And their burrows are in the bank on the right here. And if you look closely, you can see our mistnet poles there. We tagged 35 bank swallows at this site and tracked them on migration. Mostly we tracked them across the Canadian prairies, but we did track one down as far as the Gulf Coast of Texas. They actually took a pretty similar route to a lot of the white-throated sparrows. So eventually these data from the Peace River will get combined with all the data from the other tagging sites and be analyzed to examine migratory connectivity and try to identify locations where bank swallow populations might be particularly vulnerable and conservation action could help. This isn't birds, but some of our collaborators in the Peace region, Inga Jean Hansen, Brian Patterson, and Mandy Kellner are working on using Motus to study the movements of Myotis bats, and mostly northern long-eared bats and little brown bats. And they're planning to look at roosting behavior and travel distances from hibernacula, as well as dispersal patterns. It's baseline data that we need on bat populations in BC, and it's very much in the early stages, but they have done a little bit of pilot tagging at some sites in the area around Hudson's Hope, where we have a cluster of Motus stations, and then some other sites around Sayke, Mackenzie, and Dawson Creek as well. So I'm really excited to see where the bat tagging work goes in the future. I'll move on from the northeastern interior to the south coast and share a couple more projects. The Fraser Estuary here in southwestern BC, provides important habitat for shorebirds, including dunlin, tens of thousands of which spend the winter here. And other dunlin stop here during migration as they travel from their breeding grounds in Alaska to non-breeding areas as far south as Mexico. We're currently tracking the movements of dunlin in the Fraser Estuary and along the Pacific coast. And we've got 12 Motus stations in the area set up by a bunch of different researchers and collaborators, as well as additional Motus stations kind of in the nearby regions to track their local movements during the winter. And whether dunlin are flexible in the sites that they use in the Fraser Estuary has implications for their ability to adapt to changing conditions. The Fraser Estuary, as I'm sure we all know, is already a really heavily developed area since it flows through Greater Vancouver region. But there's also, of course, the proposed Roberts Bank Terminal 2 port expansion right in key habitat for Western Sandpiper and dunlin. So we've been using mist nets out on the mudflats to capture and tag dunlin in the Fraser Estuary between October and December over the last few years. This little animation is just a look at some of the movements between Motus stations over the last few winters. So we've recently finished up the fieldwork portion of this project, and data analysis is the next thing on my to-do list. We tagged dunlin at 2 sites in the Fraser Estuary, Boundary Bay and Roberts Bank, and our plan is to quantify how frequently individual dunlin are moving between different regions of the estuary and examine whether there are any seasonal changes in the movement patterns between the migration and overwintering periods. And in a preliminary look at the data, it does look like some of the dunlin are moving back and forth between Roberts Bank and Boundary Bay, though others appear to kind of more stay put in one location for long periods of time. So these are just some like really preliminary maps, but in the maps on the top region, we've got Boundary Bay, birds tagged in Boundary Bay shown in green, and the size of the point corresponds to the number of daily detections at that Motus station. And the red triangles, the tagging location. So we can see that birds tagged in Boundary Bay, a lot of them are detected in Boundary Bay, but we also have detections out along the coast, along Roberts Bank and up to Iona. And similarly for birds tagged at Roberts Bank, shown here in purple, most of the detections are happening at Roberts Bank, but we do get some moving into Boundary Bay and even into inland areas, a couple detections as far inland as Abbotsford. And on the right here, just zooming out to a little bit larger area, we do have a few larger movements in and out of the Fraser over the winter, which you can see on the map here down to Washington. Anecdotally, this sometimes corresponded with cold snaps in Vancouver. But the level of fidelity that dunlin have to certain areas of the estuary may give us some insight on their ability to withstand regional changes and hopefully help us to identify some key sites for conservation planning. In addition to kind of the more regional look of the Fraser Estuary, this dunlin tracking project is also contributing to a flyway scale project that's looking at links between dunlin physiology and movement. So we're working with collaborators from California and Mexico to track dunlin and collect blood samples from 4 sites in California, Mexico, and BC. The project's being led by some folks with the Nature Conservancy and Point Blue in California, and they're particularly interested in the effects of drought on shorebird physiology. Many shorebirds spend the non-breeding season in California's Central Valley, which has been experiencing persistent drought for years now, and 90% of the wetlands in the Central Valley have been converted to agriculture. So the folks, our collaborators in California, have been tagging birds in the Central Valley, and the rest of us have tagged birds at 3 coastal sites in Mexico, California, and here in BC, so that we can compare condition body condition across those sites, and especially so that we can compare birds spending the non-breeding season in the Central Valley to those spending the non-breeding season outside the Central Valley. So if we can evaluate body condition at various sites across the Pacific Flyway, and the data from the blood samples that we're collecting can give us information on bird stress levels, how quickly they're able to refuel and replenish the fat stores they need to migrate. And then we can link those body condition data to the Motus movement data. And one of the goals of this project is to use this new information on movement and its relation to physiological health to guide conservation programs like the one that the Nature Conservancy runs that works with farmers to create seasonal habitat for shorebirds in the Central Valley by flooding rice fields after the harvest is done. So knowing the condition of birds and the timing of when they're using those sites can help inform when the flooding can happen, and hopefully it can work so that it meets both farmers' needs as well as birds' needs. So most of the examples that I've given so far have tracked kind of larger scale movements, large scale migration or more regional movements. And your typical Motus station is good for that. Most of them have a range of at least a few kilometers, as Kianna was saying. So that works well if you're tracking migration routes along large distances, but it doesn't work so well if you're trying to study fine scale local movements and fine scale habitat use, and your station's detection zone has a 10-kilometer radius. Yes, you can get a little more detail with antenna direction and signal strength, which is a question I often get about, can you use Motus to triangulate precise locations of birds? In theory, yes, you could, but it's really challenging analytically and requires a lot of stations in a fairly small area. So it's hard work to do that. There's kind of been limited success with it. So Cellular Tracking Technologies is one of the companies that makes tags and receivers that are compatible with Motus. And they also make these little things called nodes. They're essentially little mini receivers that work with Motus. They have one small omnidirectional antenna that has a range of only about 200 to 400 meters. And the data from tag birds that they detect then get relayed back to a standard Motus station and then transferred to the Motus database. So these little nodes are much smaller and much easier to set up than a full-on Motus station, and they can be set up in a grid or other similar pattern to look at fine scale movement and habitat use. So Birds Canada is starting a new project studying insects and tree swallows at Iona Island, also here in the Fraser Estuary, and we'll be using these nodes. It'll be the first time for me to try them out. They're still a fairly new technology, so hopefully this project will be a good test to see how they work with Motus. There's already a full-size Motus station out at Iona, which is the photo on the left here. And we recently upgraded it so it will be compatible with the nodes. A bit of context is that Metro Vancouver is upgrading the wastewater treatment facilities at Iona over the next several years and doing some ecological restoration projects in conjunction with those upgrades. So we're planning a project at Iona throughout this process. And the first objective is to assess insect abundance and diversity at different locations across Iona Island. So some of our colleagues started a little pilot last year with some malaise traps that passively capture flying insects at different locations, and they'll continue insect sampling over the next couple of summers. And then the second objective of the study is to examine habitat use and movement of tree swallows, and we're aiming to start that this May, and for that part we're going to use Motus. So to look at the local movements, we'll set up 10 of these nodes, fairly evenly spaced out across the landscape, plus the insect traps at various locations. And then during the breeding season, we'll aim to catch tree swallows at nest boxes and equip them with the Motus tags that can then be detected by the nodes, and that data relayed back to the Motus station at Iona. And then the idea is that we'll be able to look at relative use of different areas of the park and how that may change across the season and in relation to insect abundance. And hopefully we can use these data to inform habitat management as the upgrades and restoration work occur at the site. And then a nice little bonus is that we'll also be able to use the larger Motus network to track the swallows as they migrate south. So we'll hopefully get some migration data out of the project as well as the local movements. So as the technology that Motus uses has expanded, like incorporating these nodes, so has the array of receiver stations. So if we kind of jump back to thinking about the system as a whole and travel back in time 10 years, this is 2014, the Motus station was largely, or sorry, the Motus system was largely limited to the East Coast and Southern Ontario. And then today we've got the over 2,000 receiver stations around the world. So it's grown a lot in a relatively short amount of time. And one of the ways that has made that happen is through regional collaborations. Certainly more and more individual projects have joined Motus and built the network that way, but regional collaborations have really been big contributors to network growth. And I'll just give you the one Western focused example, but there are a number of regional collaborations kind of all around North and South America in particular. But in 2017, there were only 30 Motus stations in all of Western, North and South America. And so the Partners in Flight Western Working Group really saw the potential for Motus in the West and put out a Motus prospectus, which is essentially an invitation for anyone who's interested in Motus to collectively grow the network in the West. And 6 years later, in 2023, there are now over 400 Motus stations in the West, which has really expanded the possibility of what we can do with Motus in the region. Similarly, with tag deployments, these points on the maps are all the different tag deployment locations. Back in 2017, there were only a few tags deployed by a handful of projects, whereas last year, over 1,500 tags were deployed in Western, North, and South America. So our goal at Motus is to be an example of the power of collaboration. Birds Canada may be the headquarters, but we really couldn't do any of it without the regional collaborations and the folks who are championing it on the ground in their home areas. So I'll leave you with a final example of collaboration, and that's a little bit of a different kind. It's many researchers pooling data that they collected on 13 independent Motus projects for a study that was led by Sjoerd Juwens, who was a postdoc at Environment Canada at the time. So he combined the detection data for 4 species of shorebirds from 13 different Motus projects and looked at migration speed. And what he found was that all species migrated faster in the spring and made longer stopovers on migration in the fall. But their airspeeds, their flight speeds were actually faster in the fall. So they actually flew faster, but they made longer stops. So the overall pace of migration was slower. There's a few reasons why this could be happening. It could be that they had slower airspeeds in spring so they could save energy for breeding, or maybe they had higher airspeeds in fall to avoid predators, kind of getting ahead of a wave of raptors that migrate a little bit later. So there's a number of reasons why that could be happening, but it's kind of an interesting example of what you can do with a big data set that spans the continent or hemisphere when you've got many projects using the same system. So these are 13 independent projects. They can all use the kind of meet their own objectives for those projects, but then the data can also be later combined to get more out of it. And kind of that's what we aim for Motus to be about. It's community science, so we strive to be a global network of researchers, volunteers, and conservation practitioners, and we hope it can provide some robust and fine-scale information that's applicable and fairly accessible and affordable. and hopefully ultimately generate information that's relevant for conservation. And I didn't really get into it today, but Motus also has an educational component. We have a number of stations that are on schools. A few different schools here in BC have Motus stations, and we have some curriculum linked activities for high school students. And we've also done some activities and visited classrooms at elementary schools as well, so that we can really talk with students about migration and bird conservation. So all in all, we hope that by being a big collaborative system, Motus can be greater than the sum of its parts. And of course, I owe a great deal of thanks to all the many collaborators who take part in Motus and are what makes it work, and who have put so much work into the various projects that I kind of showed you a little bit about today, as well as, of course, all the other projects happening that are using the system. So thanks so much for tuning in for our talk, and I would be happy to answer any questions if we have some time for that.